Up here are the professional organizations. That is, organizations that exist not to advance a particular agenda, but to simply serve the communication and training needs of a particular profession, like the American Medical Association, the American Institute of Architects, etc. There's a gajillion out there. Not only are they made up of people who know what they're doing in terms of expertise, but for the association to actually come out with a statement generally requires that most of the members agree with it. So there's going to be a bruising and very thorough process to make sure it's not some whim or a flimsy statement that may later embarrass the organization. So the bias really tends to be taken out of those statements. Now, it's important to note that I just totally made this stuff up. I just pulled this out of my hat. This is what I do when I'm deciding how much weight to put in statements I've read. And I'm sharing it here to suggest as a tool to use in our discussions. If you have a better tool for how to evaluate sources or some insight that refines this, please share it with me. And while I'm confident of the two ends, so that I'd put individual layperson at the bottom, individual professional just above, and I put professional organizations and statements that contradict the normal bias at the top, in the middle here, it's much more murky to me. For instance, I don't know if I'd put petitions above or below think tanks. I'd put some petitions above other ones, some think tanks above other ones. It also gets mixed up here. You may find a book published by a think tank, but it was written by a professional individual, so you wouldn't necessarily weight it more than any other book. You really do have to think about what biases might be present in any given example. Remember, this is just a starting point. Now, armed with our credibility spectrum, we can explore our grid more. Let's start by trying to get a sense of the probability of human-caused global climate change being true. Before we look at direct statements about it, I'll share a rule of thumb that may be useful to you if you have the inclination. You look at what the scientists are saying to each other when the media isn't interviewing them. I regularly read some scientific and lay scientific literature, and I'll tell you, for a number of years now, the tenor about climate change has been not at all controversial. Generally, when it's mentioned, it assumes the reader is on board with the idea that humans are causing the climate to change. The hot debate is on what exactly it will look like and how fast it'll happen. That should tell you something. In the video How It All Ends, I shared that the two most well-respected scientific organizations on the planet, AAAS and NAS, recently called for significant and immediate action on climate change. They fall into that topmost area on our spectrum of credibility, so it's worth looking at exactly what they said. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, has over 144,000 members, has been around since before the Civil War, and is the publisher of the journal Science, the gold standard for peer-reviewed journal. These aren't nobodies. These are somebodies. These are the buddies. These are they, as in they say. In December of 2006, it approved an unprecedented statement calling for action on climate change. Next time you hear someone matter-of-factly say global warming is bunk, remember these next couple paragraphs and who it is who wrote them. The AAAS statement starts out, "The scientific evidence is clear. Global climate change caused by human activities is occurring now, and it is a growing threat to society. Accumulating data from across the globe reveal a wide array of effects." Well, you know these guys are science geeks when they say data reveal instead of data reveals. "Rapidly melting glaciers, destabilization of major ice sheets, increases in extreme weather, rising sea level, shifts in species ranges, and more. The pace of change and the evidence of harm have increased markedly over the last 5 years. The time to control greenhouse gas emissions is now." Remember, this isn't Al Gore talking. This is AAAS. The statement continues on to say, "As expected, intensification of droughts, heat waves, floods, wildfires, and severe storms is occurring, with a mounting toll on vulnerable ecosystems and societies. These events are early warning signs of even more devastating damage to come, some of which will be irreversible. Delaying action to address climate change will increase the environmental and societal consequences as well as the costs. The longer we wait to tackle climate change, the harder and more expensive the task will be." Doesn't this start to make you a little nervous? This isn't your local Save the Stream organization. These are the guys who know what they're doing better than anyone else in the world. And the statement ends with an uncharacteristic call for action. "It is time to muster the political will for concerted action. Stronger leadership at all levels is needed. The time is now. We must rise to the challenge." This isn't Greenpeace. These are some of the stodgiest, most well-trained, intelligent people on the planet. They're not infallible, but if you're not going to listen to what they have to say about a scientific issue, then who are you going to listen to? I mean, if that's not a slam dunk, what would be a slam dunk? So who are you going to listen to? It's not a rhetorical question. Who would you listen to? Maybe the National Academy of Sciences. NAS, which is pretty much the other crown jewel of scientific societies, has 2,100 members. Incidentally, 1 out of every 10 members has a Nobel Prize, and it's been around since 1863. The NAS statement of June 2005 wasn't just from the NAS. It was a joint statement made along with the national academies of the other major industrialized countries, the G8, and included China, India, and Brazil as well. The NAS statement said, "The scientific understanding of climate change is now sufficiently clear to justify nations taking prompt action." And it called on world leaders to acknowledge that the threat of climate change is clear and increasing, and recognize that delayed action will increase the risk of adverse environmental effects and will likely incur a greater cost. There you have the 2 most well-respected scientific organizations on the planet, along with the national science academies of pretty much every other major industrialized nation, all saying the globe is warming, we're the ones doing it, it's gonna be bad, and we better do something about it quick. That is huge. This isn't a couple or a dozen or 100 scientists talking. That doesn't mean that every member agrees with the statements, but if AAAS and NAS say something about a topic in science, that is as close as we are ever going to get to a statement of what science knows. They are the science establishment, capital letters. If that's not good enough for you to change your mind about something, then I gotta tell you, nothing from science ever will be, because it just doesn't get any stronger than that. It's worth noting here that both AAAS and NAS statements explicitly endorsed the findings of the IPCC. I mention this because a lot of skeptics simply dismiss the IPCC as a political hack, implying that its findings are incompetent and biased because it's a member or it's an arm of the UN. Well, maybe now that won't be such an easy dismissal to make, given the endorsement of the 2 top scientific bodies in the world. AAAS coming out and saying that climate change is a real problem that needs to be dealt with fast is a lot like when the AMA came out and said that smoking was bad for you. You can still find doctors that disagreed, but the issue is pretty much as close as settled as it could ever be. The only way it could get any more settled would be if the tobacco companies themselves admitted it, which they finally did long after it was obvious to everybody else that they'd been financing a misinformation campaign. Well, it turns out that analogy will go even further, because remember that other category at the top of our credibility spectrum? Organizations making statements that contradict their normal stance? In the video, How It All Ends, I briefly shared, well, okay, I flashed it on the board for a little over 1 second, a tiny bit of the statements from the U.S. Carbon Action Partnership, which includes Shell, BP, ConocoPhillips, Ford, Chrysler, GM, GE, PGE, DuPont, and Dow Chemical. These guys are calling for mandatory requirements on carbon emissions on themselves. And get this, last year none other than Exxon CEO Rex Tillerson himself said about climate change, the potential risk to society could prove to be significant. So despite the areas of uncertainties that do exist, it is prudent to develop and implement strategies that address the potential risks. He may not sound totally gung-ho, but given that Exxon has long been the poster child of corporate climate change denial, that's pretty much like the tobacco companies finally saying that yes, it may be true that cigarettes can harm you. Plus, for the first time last year, Exxon didn't donate to the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a think tank that has been at the forefront of the climate change issue. In the past, when I've cited the AAAS and NAS statements, thinking they're a slam dunk, I've sometimes heard the criticism that those citations are just arguments from authority and are therefore useless. Talk about grasping at straws. The criticism can be valid in a formal logic structure, like in mathematics, but we're talking knowledge about the physical world. Of course authority matters. Honey, remember your doctor warned you that if you didn't cut down on the salt, you'll have another heart attack. Don't just argue from authority. Explain to me the details of cellular metabolism and osmosis, or I'd eat as many chips as I darn well please. And ask yourself this, does the Earth go around the sun, or does the sun go around the Earth? No one even seriously questions that anymore, right? Try this sometime. Stand back and point to the sun in the sky. A few hours later, stand in the same spot, facing the same direction, and do it again. Is your arm pointing in the same direction as before? No! Clearly, the sun is the thing that moved, and clearly the Earth is too large to have gone anywhere, and it's right where you left it. If your senses and your common sense are so easily fooled, then how do you decide what to believe about the natural world? Well, why do you so firmly believe that the Earth orbits the sun instead of the other way around, despite all evidence and common sense to the contrary? You believe it because